Welcome to the Ordinals Podcast, produced by Ord Media, featuring the top builders, projects, and investors pioneering Bitcoin inscription protocols and the future of digital artifacts.
Welcome, everyone, to the Ordinals Podcast. I'm your host, Ragnar Lifthrasir. We finally have a guest on to talk about audio inscriptions, and he's the perfect person to do it, Jim.btc. He's working on a really cool project called Ordinals, so it's like audio with ordinals, so Ordinals, and it aims to create a world of possibilities for Web3 music, but there's many other possible things you can do with it. So, Jim, welcome to the Ordinals Podcast.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here. I know you have, a history of, NFT and stacks, and briefly you told me, you have your background in music. Before we get into that, let's jump right into Ordinals. So for a layperson who's kind of maybe new to Ordinals, likes music and audio, how would you describe Ordinals?
The idea for Ordinals was really born out of the idea of, there being an audio source of truth, which could be used like a library for some of the things which we briefly spoke about, some things that I asked ChatGPT to come up with a list of potential uses just the other night, because I hadn't actually expressed it myself, but probably half of the things that ChatGPT suggested in those comments were things that were already on my mind, which was things like preservation of language. I have a friend, a very close friend in Australia, who is actually part of this whole story of the mutiny on the Bounty, and he speaks an almost forgotten language that's a mix of Tahitian and Old English. There's only a few hundred of them that exist, and things like that have been on my mind. I wanted to record him 20 years ago. He ended up getting throat cancer and has lost his voice, and so I never actually managed to record him, but it's just something that's been on my mind, that it would be great to have this kind of seed bank, if you will, for audio, and that's certainly one use case would be for remembering phonetics, and not to mention the educational aspect of it as well, but actually for things that are kind of relics of the past, that are to be heard and listened to. That was kind of where it started, and then from there I was looking into ways to store audio on the blockchain. Obviously, you can just upload audio as it is, as a WAV file or an MP3, but you're quite restricted to the amount of metadata that you can attach to these things. And if we were to start what I'm planning to be, it's a global community-driven audio library for everyone to submit to and for everyone to access. And for that, we need really good indexing. We need metadata tags that can file this audio away so it can be pulled out, through a number of searches. And then through that process, I started. It's obviously quite expensive putting audio on, so I wasn't going to start with long speeches or anything. And something, because of my history as a musician and a producer, it just sort of sprung to my mind to test by putting some samples up that I could pull back in. And then I sort of had a vague idea in my head of, in the future, it might be interesting to see if I can sequence these things. But it all kind of happened in the same move. I kind of experimented with a couple of loops, and then I put them into I created a new standard, which I published around early June sometime, called Ordinals. It was initially Ordinals with just an AU for audio, but then I found there was another outfit who were doing something with BRC20s, a very different project, but the same name. So I quickly rebranded to Ordinals. And then sort of cracked on, and then I created this the standard, which is converting the audio into base 64 embedded text, which then sits inside a JSON. So that JSON then becomes almost like a collector's card where you can put any data on there that you want. I've been creating this. I've got about 30 fields so far, and I'm also working through some fields that should hopefully make for easy interoperability with all the world's performing rights societies. So I'll have some fields in there that will have all the right formats for sort of hopefully engaging with those too. But yeah, so once I built this sequencer and then started recalling these files, I realized that the web API does a really fantastic job of pulling these things together, much better than I expected. And then so I started going down the rabbit hole of creating the Ordinal sequencer, It's almost like the library is if you think of it as a layer one, there's the audio source of truth, which is kind of containing everything on that layer. Oh, sorry, I dropped out on you there for a second. Yeah, so if the layer one is the audio source of truth, is the library where all of this audio exists, this sequencer is kind of like the first of many potential layer twos that I've built here, which has one use really, which is accessing musical samples or other samples that aren't musical, but in the idea of putting them into musical sequences, which can then themselves be inscribed as songs, if you will. But these are not songs anything like you know them, because there's no recording. I'm very close to getting the first sort of demo inscription made, which will be a series of instructions, which is what these ordinal compositions come out as, which is a series of URLs showing you where these musical samples are, and then a series of instructions telling them when they should be triggered in the song. And so you end up with just this very small text file, which then, using recursion, using the actual sequencer, which will be inscribed as the engine for driving this, I can then create a separate player which will link the song file with the sequencer in a very, very small file, which will then itself be the player, which will play this song. But then the second that no one is actually accessing the player and actively executing these instructions, there is no song. There's no recording. So the entire thing is put together in it's programmatic in how it's constructed. And so when no one's actually listening to those instructions, the song itself, although you can hear it as a song, doesn't actually exist as a recording anyway. Yeah. Which is quite interesting.
Okay, well that's interesting. So there's a lot to break down. So let's start at the most basic, because right now, I mean, anyone could inscribe an audio file. So this does much more than that. So correct me where I'm wrong here, but this is basically two things. It's a protocol. So the first thing that you were talking about was inscribing the audio data in the form of a base64 embedded JSON file. So is the basic idea there that you can have text that is kind of human readable, easy to index? Is that the basic purpose of doing it that way in this JSON?
The base 64 is just a way of turning audio into text. That's one of the sort of things that needs to be done here. In fact, it makes the files about 30% bigger, so it makes it a bit more expensive to convert audio this way. But again, if you want it to be indexed and part of this library, then it's necessary that the thing is that the audio is either referenced from another file, which is another kind of option, but that kind of complicates things. Having the audio in its own file, certainly one of the things I found with making the sequencer is that because I can add so much metadata that can't be added to a normal audio file, this audio can turn up at the sequencer like a smart sample. It can turn up and it's already carrying a lot of the stuff that the user might otherwise be expected to deal with, to say, okay, what speed is this? What tempo is it? What pitch is it? What key is it? What sample rate is it? All these sorts of things that usually would be down to a person who is using a sampler to, collate all this information. Instead, the samples can carry this themselves, which then again means that your sequencer, which will be an inscription itself, has less work to do. The more you can sort of spread this stuff out and put it where it should be, modularizing it, the sample having all of its own metadata when it arrives means the sequencer doesn't have to do that work because the sample turns up with it. And in the same way with the seed bank idea in the library for indexing, it's kind of the same thing. If you want it to be searchable in all these different ways, another really great benefit with JSON is that it's UTF-8 encoded. Now, what that means is that it's searchable in all languages. And so that, again, is a very important thing if you're putting together, something of a museum level audio record. It needs to be searchable by everybody. It can't just be in English, for example. We need it to be searchable in all languages and also searchable in many different ways. It's not enough just to have the name of the file. There's always got to be some context. And again, you want that context to be attached to the file, for ease of searching and indexing. So that's, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because otherwise, without this, it's tough. You can upload an audio file, and there's some kind of metadata that you can, attach to it, sort of. But when you're talking about it, you're trying to create an entire music library that has all the data that you would want, and then that you would want to probably update in the future. And not only that, but then you want to take that, what you were saying about, to have that there, so then you can do things with that. So it's not just purely static data, that you could then make it more, is it fair to say, programmatic
Totally. For
when you do
the
it this way?
user, I mean, the forms that I've got on ordinals.com, if you have a look at ordinals.com, you can see underneath the sequencer is the form for creating these ordinal JSON files with your audio and then inscribing them. And if you have a look there, you can see that what you can do for music, but what you can do, I have got another form which I just haven't quite finished yet, and I'll put up there. It's got 30 or 40 different fields on it, including user input. You've got certain fields where I might not have covered it, and so people want to have their own user entered fields, and then again all of these fields for hopefully every royalty system in the world. So you've got a way of having the right reference number or code that can be used all the way around the world. Again, just making, if it is even a song file with licensing or a sample with licensing, and you can include so much information there, right down to your own licensing, requests, requirements for, how you want to license this, whether it's a free license or whether you have different licensing restrictions for where it's used, all the stuff that a publisher would do. You can now just make this file express itself, and you can choose that yourself. So it's
going back to like the big idea of,
sorry, go on.
yeah, so that going back to like the big picture of ordinals and inscriptions, like why do we need this? Why not just put it on Amazon, AWS? Why not save it, to the cloud? Why do we need all this, right? So there's a few things it sounds like. First is just that immutability, that you want something where the data is there forever for various reasons, right? Censorship resistance, integrity of the audio, things like that, where you don't want it to be changed, deleted, altered. So that seems like kind of the first reason, like before we get into like too much of the details, that's the advantage of doing this on inscriptions, right? And having it be, I think I saw source of truth in there as well. So
This is it.
that's
With
sort of the
with the
base.
library stuff, that's where you want that immutability and that security. If you're talking about a historic record, then you definitely don't want to be doing it anywhere other than somewhere super secure. And for a lot of people, it's the super secure that you can trust, and this is the super secure that everyone can trust. So that's on the library level. And then on the more trivial level, with the music stuff, this isn't something that has to be kept or saved. But again, one of the real benefits that I'm finding with working with this sequencer is that I can create a file, I can download my arrangement as a JSON file, and I can send that to anyone who can then go and open this blockchain version of the player. And then which I haven't actually put, I've got an older version of the player on the blockchain, but doesn't have the load and save function, unfortunately. But you can go in and play around with it. But with the new player, I can send these files to anyone, and I know that they can log in to the same player because it's inscribed. It's already historic. It's happened. It's like it's done. It's immutable. So if I can create a file in that player and I can send it to someone, then I know that wherever they are in the world, as long as they've got access to the internet, I don't have to send them the additional files. If I was when I used to work in Logic and I have to send files to people, you've got to package up all your stuff. You've got to package up your audio units, all the plugins that you're using. Everything's got to be packaged up to make sure this person's got what they need. This is the very beginnings of an online, a Web3 production environment. But once this is really built out, it's like the most perfect production environment, the most perfect patch bay. People can keep adding stuff for an eternity, but the stuff that works now will always work the same way it works. The samples that you're using will always have the same relationship to the player. It will always be in the same place. The instructions will always read the same, but the system can keep getting added to. The sequencer, I'll start adding some effects and synthesizers I've been inscribing as well. And once these are all starting to be accessible, the sequencer, even when it's an old sequencer with some basic standards like the Ordinal protocol and some other protocols that I'm coming up with for the effects units, it'll be infinitely forward compatible. Anything that's created in 10, 20 years, as long as it uses that protocol, it'll be able to be pulled into that sequencer, even though the sequencer itself will probably be 20, 30 kilobytes. It's not like the end of the world. It's not a massive thing. It's something that can be updated. But it's just really interesting that, what you do on that now will be the way it works forever. And that can't change no matter what anyone does to the studio, no matter how much more equipment they put in or things they add to the patch bay. The things that you can do now will never change. And that's really, really cool, really amazing to be able to share stuff with anyone like that. And all they need is access to the Chrome browser, really.
It's so strange because at least I should say, I usually think of, inscriptions as data, art, and just sort of kind of static files. But in fact, what's really going on is sort of it's functioning software. It's programmable software. It's doing things. It's not like display this JPEG. It's actual software. And that brings up a couple interesting things, as you said. So kind of putting into my simple words, it's basically like a standard in a sense, right? It's a standard of software because you mentioned, you have to have this plugin or this, factor. And it's like, no, there's just this one thing that everyone uses. And it's not like you don't need a license for it. It's open source. It's on the blockchain. It's not going to go anywhere. So that's just one cool sort of standard, way to do it. So it's standardized with being open source, permissionless, no cost to it. And then you were talking about like the integrity of the files as well. Maybe this is a bad example, but I remember, you'll see some great album and they say it was remastered and people don't like the remastered version, right? They want the old version or vice versa. But this allows you to say, okay, here's the original version that stays forever, but it can be updated, but it won't be deleted. And I'm even thinking about, this is a slightly different example, but like books now. So books are actually being rewritten based on new political ideologies, that the way things were 50 years ago, people don't like the politics back then. So they actually change the text. I got to imagine there's audio files where they would want to do that, especially political speech. And what are some of those types of things where you definitely want to, have the integrity of the original audio file besides just you like the music?
That is interesting. I mean, there's the idea of political speeches and things. I mean, it's almost like the internet, does have some security in, like people have found out when they've been, when they had all these revenge videos people would put up and they can't be taken down. There is an element of safety in the internet in that, if anything is put on the internet, it ends up just being shared. And it's a bit like a blockchain. It ends up being distributed in a decentralized, but it's chaotic. It's untraceable, but it's there. It's probably, your file isn't lost if there's any public interest in it, for example, old speeches and things. But, in the same breath, having it in one place where you just know where it is, you know where it will be, you know where you can access it. But then on top of that, there's things like, security. One of the first conversations I had with someone when I spoke about this idea, someone in my family actually who sort of works in lots of different businesses, and he was saying he had been talking to his friend who is in voice recognition software, and he was like, "This is a really interesting concept for this because it's like you could." I mean, I was thinking you wouldn't necessarily put the live samples in there, but again, using this sort of indexing and encryption, you could at least be storing files potentially in an encrypted way, but where both the voice recognition company and the user who owns the voice, both have a key, a way of accessing that. So you then have that shared source of truth rather than you saying, okay, I've given you my voice, but it's held on your servers, or worse, it's held on the servers of a third party that you trust. Instead, it's like we can both agree that it's in the one place, that we both know where it is, and we know that I know that's me, they know it's me, it's encrypted, I've got a private key for it. There's those sorts of applications where, again, that adds an extra level of security and takes away the need for a layer of trust because you're both operating in the same domain.
And so, that's security is a very interesting use case for inscriptions and long term. And a lot of times when I think about like an application or a tool, I like to think of it as, what if I had this tool 5 years ago or 10 years ago, what would I have done with it? How would the world be different? How would people have been using this? And when I think of things that way, it really becomes clear to me whether something has value or not. And one thing for me as a person, like if this had been around 5 years ago, let's go back 30 years ago, actually. If this had been around 30 years ago, I would have loved to have recorded like a family member who has since passed away and having that story being there forever, because now there's generations. Like my grandfather fought in World War II over Germany. He had shrapnel in his arms. I mean, war veteran story type stuff. He died of cancer. So just that preservation, and then being able to add that. So going into the recursive part, let's go into that. It'd be interesting to recursive inscriptions to add that to his audio file, maybe another vet, maybe someone from our family who talked about that. So can you go into that about where does recursive inscriptions come into this?
Recursion is really what's made this all possible, because when Ordinals first came out around February, I think I found out about it around February or March, there was no recursion. I'm not a developer, but I do have an idea about how these things work in a rudimentary way. And one of the things that I have always said, I've worked with Bitcoin since 2014. I actually imported the UK's first Bitcoin ATM in 2014 to learn about it. I was touring at the time, had just had my third child, was desperate to get off the road and come home. And so I remortgaged my house and I imported a Bitcoin ATM because I'd read the white paper and I had gone, this is money remittance. This is the revolution that the world's unbanked have been waiting for. So I thought, well, I'll make it my mission to learn about it. So I bought this ATM, and that was how I'd kind of learned about these things. And so I'm not a developer. It's not how I got into this game. Sorry, you have to remind me what your question was. I went back too far.
Yeah, recursive inscription. So how is it that you can use that to update things, to add to things, rather than just one inscription at a time?
The point I was getting to is when I did first get into it, I remembered someone telling me, the Satoshis, they're all identifiable, a bit like a banknote. And so I think the idea of recursion, as soon as we were inscribing on Satoshis, I was like, okay, well, I know that at some point I could identify another Satoshi. So if I find a Satoshi and I say, okay, here's a piece of code, and I tell this code like a time traveling box or something, I write and inscribe a really old inscription that says, when this specific Satoshi has some information, this really old inscription can suddenly look like it's told the future, look, and it was just an idea I was just running around in my head. And this is prior to recursion actually being a thing. But so it was there. It was in my mind that this is coming. There's something's going to happen here. And so actually, when I heard the talk about it, I had already been working on some pieces of code, which I've been trying to do on Stacks. But because all of the markets were operating, they are using their own wallets and everything. It's not like on blockchain. They need to be safer. There's things that pose a risk, and certainly in recursive code, there is risks, in people putting things on your computer, making you click something and doing something bad. So they were very careful about that. So I couldn't really experiment with it. But the minute I heard that Casey Rodemore, I heard the guys on their GitHub were saying, we're about to launch this recursion. I think like the day they announced it, I think I made about 10 recursive applications, none of which worked because I wasn't doing it right. I knew that there was some way of doing this, and I was just hammering it out there. I mean, these are all tiny little files, but I was just trying to make this work. All of them less than a kilobyte. Some of which I've now gone back recently. They're all sort of sub 100K, and found that they actually work. Because again, one of my lack of understanding of these things, that it's browser security, and this security is something that actual websites can put. They have some control over that, and so it's now some of the marketplaces. If I go and look at those early ordinals, they're visible, even though they're not still on ordinals.com, because they have a higher level of security or different checks that they take out than these other sites. But so the idea is really, it's like having something on your hard drive. Any files that you could have on your hard drive that can talk to each other, you can think about that happening on the Bitcoin blockchain. The only difference is they can't be updated, after they've been inscribed. So that's where the difficulty sort of comes in that, these things are written in stone. But if you have a plan for how these things work, they're constantly executed. And when they're executed, the users can put an input in, so there's things that can change despite the fact that they're hard coded. The code can still be activated in different ways. and it can send out messages. So you can always build something in the future, knowing that this old piece of code sends out messages when X, Y, or Z happens. Now this future one can hear those messages when they happen. I don't
So
know
let's
if there's
give an
a way.
example. Yeah, let's give an example. Maybe you can say 5 files or 10 files, whatever you think makes sense, and say we're going to have these 5 files. We're going to use recursion to link those together. What would be an example of maybe a few files? What does file 1 do? File 2? What's the sound?
I mean, that's kind of
Walk
what's
us through
going
like
on
a
with like
basic example.
ordinals and the sampler, the sequencer. You know, that's pulling in lots of different files together. Probably a simpler way to explain it is something else that I did. Something I did on Stacks when the Stacks mainnet first launched. We put out a collection. It was the first generative collection. There were no collections other than the stuff we'd done with Fatboy Slim and Cara Delevingne, and we did these. It was just a very simple idea, which was 4 squares of color with a number 1 logo in front of it, which was at the top or at the bottom, and these 4 squares of color had 7 different colors. So I think there was 4,802 possible outcomes, and we ended up only making 91 of them. They're supposed to be 111, but the network crashed and we only made 91. So there was always 20 missing. And when Ordinals came along, I thought, let's get those 20 as Ordinals. It kind of takes what was already an interesting story and bridges the gap to actual Bitcoin. The last 20 end up on Bitcoin. And then from there, the recursive idea was, I was experimenting with how to shrink code, because at this point Ordinals was now a thing and people were like, wow, it's getting expensive and we need to be working on smaller files. I'd always been working with small files, but I was like, how far can I push this? And so with ChatGPT, I started investigating this thing called pixel arrays or pixel matrices, which is a very simple way of taking those 4 squares of color in the code show up as potentially thousands of individual RGB points saying this point is orange, all in a row for that whole square, and then this point is green for like 1,000 times here. And with a pixel array, you can shorten that to almost a single line that just says, 1,000 oranges here in a row. And so it just goes, okay, instead of saying it 1,000 times, you just said, this is 1,000 of these. And then I can do it across. I can say it's 1,000 of these and 1,000 this way as well. And now I've got 2 lines of code that now fills this entire box of orange. And so I was experimenting with that stuff, and I then managed to make a software HTML version of this collection called the Hash1 collection that was entirely code. And I think I made this before the recursion thing had happened. It was when recursion happened that I was then able to go back once I figured out how it actually worked, and I could go back to this code and I could then request any one of those. So now I'd got the 4,802, the entire collection, actually in this single piece of code, which I think is 4 kilobytes. It was 100 megabytes worth of images that I'd now shrunken into a 4 kilobyte HTML code, which just had the code for creating these 4,802 images. And now in the future, I was able to go back and say, okay, I want you now to give me the one with the blue, the green, the orange, and the red square, and the one at the top. And again, I can now call that with equally a very small piece of code. Everything's just in that kind of engine that has all of the instructions needed to produce all of it. So that was a way of just using 2.
So in terms of like an impact on users, so whether you're a musician or you produce audio in some way, speech, whatever it might be, how does this help you? Is it just a purely economic thing, so you don't have to spend so much on your inscribing, uploading files that already exist? On a practical level, how does this help people?
I mean, this is where it's interesting with the Ordinal sequencer, which is like fun to play with and it's free to play with. As people add more samples, there'll be more fun you can have with the sequencer. But it basically loads up as a 64-step sequencer, and you can trigger points along the way. But where it gets interesting is once you've created a song, you can then inscribe that song, as I said before, as a series of instructions, which might be already. It could be 2, 3, 5 kilobytes, unless it's like it could be a whole film score. It could be like 30 kilobytes. And so that's now your song file is quite big. So now what I'm working on, and I'll have hopefully by the end of the week, is that we've got the sequencer, which is the engine. And then you make the song one time. And now you have a player that loads the song, but it loads the song from the song's inscription into the inscription of the sequencer and plays the song. And now that file, I'm hoping to get it sub 1 kilobyte. So that should mean that then when you're coming to distribute the actual song, you're not having to write the actual full song the sheet music, if you will. You're not having to actually send that out every time with the song. You've just got another piece of code that knows where the song is, knows where the player is, knows how to put them together, and now it's got its own little UI, a little player, image or whatever that the user can now hit play, hit stop. But it just plays that one song. But it's hopefully, the cost is still not cheap, but it's still around, $1 to $2 versus maybe $10, which already is cheap when you're thinking about an actual song. If you were to go and actually inscribe an actual song now, even MP3 level, it's 3.5 megabytes. It's not even going to be possible. Those things, like people filling an entire block with like one file, it's few and far between now. So at the best you could do is break it up into maybe 10 parts, which are 10 audio parts, and piece those together. But so this new way of doing things is interesting. Once that library builds, it's like you've put a kick drum, you've got a snare, you've got a hi-hat, you've got a bass, you've got all these things, but you're using them also in a recursive way. So instead of having this whole song file, you've just got this kick that's played 150 times. You've got this snare that's played 150 times. You've got all these individual elements that have already been paid for. They're on chain. Now you're just putting them in together into this new programmatic version. It's a song, but like I said, not a song like you know it, because there's no recording. But so that's really the beauty of it, is that you can then create it as a file that is accessed by another file. Now, if you want to make 100 of these, okay, it's only going to cost you $100 or $200 to put out, 100 players that all hold your song. The player itself is also quite interactive. It can listen to the song. I've already built one where when you hit play, it's listening to the tempo of the song and some of the instruments, and it's animating certain parts of the player. That can all be very easily tied in together. Some of that I hope to hand over. So as a musician, you can then say, I really like when the headphones on this player animate at a certain time, but I want it to animate with this instrument. I want it to come on at this time. And they can kind of program all that before inscribing it. So they know that when their player goes out, they've had a little extra touch on it. It's not just the song. They've added some additional flourishes. And also there's more recursion. There's always, at the moment, I'm building a player that is just a player, but there'll be options for people to add their own cover art, even their own music videos. And I yet to say whether I could sync the music videos up. At some point, there'll be a way to do that. I'm working on a project at the moment with Counterfeit Culture to create a music video where we're linking a video that also is being, programmatically assembled, inscribed frame by frame. And then I've got to sort of build a piece of software which will bring all these frames together into a film with the music and sound in time. There's a whole world here. Once I'm doing a lot of the hard work now, but once there are more of these, there will be, I promise you, there will be all of these kind of labs or whatever, platforms online for doing this stuff. I'm doing it manually now, but pretty soon it'll be really easy to say, okay, take this sequence of images and, redo it. You'll probably end up having fans of a film where there's like millions of fans going, let's between us inscribe every frame of this movie and the sound so it can be recursively pulled together. If there's enough money there, yes, it'll cost a fortune. If there's enough people, if the will is there, then there is a way. These people could put entire films, classic films, online. In fact, I probably shouldn't be suggesting that because there's obviously a copyright thing, and that's. But at any rate, it's just that there's nothing is not possible. What probably is interesting is maybe someone making a film that way. Making a film and then having it actually released the way I'm putting out songs, which is there is no film. There's just a series of instructions that if you execute them, they will create the film in front of your eyes. And that's this kind of programmatic procedure.
Yeah. So then in a way, it really helps creatives because you already have like a lot of the substrates that you will need to do that. And then the other thing is, with art, there's always this idea that no artist really is build something completely brand new, but you build on the work of previous artists, right? We stand on the shoulders of giants. And so when you have these different files that you can kind of program, connect together, you can take the best ones and really make something really special. And I was kind of talking about recursion with Danny Yang, on-chain monkeys. And we were talking about the files. One way to sort of see which audio files might be the most valuable isn't necessarily like a song that sold for the most. It's more like what sound audio files that you upload are referenced the most. or library, whatever it is. And so that's also a way to sort of establish the value of something. It's like, hey, you know, all these great artists used file A, B, C, and D that
Yeah.
Jim.btc inscribed, you know, way back in 2023, and they're still using all of his great stuff. So it's sort of like a historical record of like what has been the most useful, impactful
That's the beauty of
inscriptions. And the
every
earlier you
inscription.
do that, right?
Has that information built into it, so you have that ledger there. You know, from the minute people are inscribing songs, it's like, here's every sample I used, and if you look at that sample, there's the owner. You know, I don't know who they are, but I know that if I'm going to pay someone for this song, I know who it needs to be. And again, that owner also has been able to, through the Ordinal protocol, put all that metadata in there, so they can also say, like, this is licensable. Unless you're going to pay me for it, you can't use it. And so therefore, if I then take my composition to a record label and they say, oh, look, there's a sample in here, again, they put a lot of time and effort and money into this stuff, into checking samples. Whereas if the song arrives and it's got a built-in ledger saying, okay, here's the song, and if you click on each of these links, it takes you to the sample. And if it's an Ordinal sample, it's also now got its licensing information in there. And again, someone can just build some software. So even as a label, I don't even have to do that. You just literally, this software just looks at it and goes, yeah, you've used a sample that I'm not prepared to pay for. But then that musician can also just very quickly just go, okay, well, I've just got to swap out that sample because I'm not even mixing this to give it to you. It's in its sheet music form. And so all I have to do is go, okay, all of those, that line there just changes to a new sample that is license free or whatever, and straight back to the label, for checking. So
Yeah, so I could see why a lot of people benefit from this. And one thing to think about that I think is fun sometimes is who might not like it. Like it's fun to think about who likes it, but it's also who might not like this. Can you think of any examples or
I can
people
think of
or
lots.
well, let's hear it.
I mean, coming from the music industry, this is something that I have these conversations with musicians, both people who are very established as well as grassroots musicians all the time. The music industry is it's a beast, and it's like the banking sector. It's not really any different. They're not going to let anything go quickly. We've had several revolutions that we thought were going to completely level the playing field, and they never did. And in fact, the playing field for music, I don't think, can ever truly be leveled, because there will always be a need for the trendsetters, the radio pluggers of the world, people who tell the people what to play. That's always going to be there. But the idea of, for me, the most revolutionary thing about this idea is, if we go back to that example I was saying before about, if you were going to use this system to decide on how to pay people based on which samples were used in a song, if that model was to exist, then what that means is that there is a complete reversal of the journey that money takes. And so the money goes straight to the songwriter and the sample holders. And so that instantly flips the entire model on its head, where I've now got Spotify going, oh, hey, Jim, were you happy with the work we did this month? Did we send enough people from it? If it's cool, can we send our invoice? And the label going, hey, yeah, that's all done really well. Can we invoice for the work we've done? Which is like how everyone else's job works. It just never has for musicians or other artists. But it's like, that's ultimately where I would love for this to go, where it just empowers people by switching how the money moves. And so the money ends up going to the musician, and the musician gets to say, yeah, no, I think Spotify did a good job this month. I'm gonna pay them.
Yeah, and that's what I love about Bitcoin. I like to think about it as which gatekeeper does it remove? That's how I like to think of Bitcoin. Like, who is it that's blocking the producers? Whether bankers are the gatekeepers, the government are the gatekeepers. And so Bitcoin helps us to get around that. And music has gatekeepers that have just keep stuck around. Like, Napster didn't solve that issue 30 years ago, did it? And so this offers a new way to do that. And I've read so many awful things about the music industry and lawsuits, and it seems like it's a never-ending thing. And I always wondered, why can't this be solved? But you're saying that with Ordinals and with Audionals, that this could help that, because of, like, why exactly? Because the file is there. It's immutable. It can't be changed. It can't be altered. We know who owns it, right? So
Yeah,
is that the
that's
basis
the
of
main
that,
thing,
and
is that
then
you
the
know who owns.
programmability?
That's the main thing, is that you know who owns it. You know where that money's supposed to go. But really, this is the start of what I hope will be a revolution. I don't know where this goes. For me, the thing that's really going to change things in a realistically, like a believable way for me, is just re-education. This is what it's always been with musicians. As a tour manager, I spent many years working with young bands, and I just saw, half the problem with the music industry is that musicians are all trained to be so grateful for any attention that they get, for their work and for their art, that they kind of get lulled into this weird, they just sign stuff. They don't think about these things. And for me, some of this stuff, just the idea that it empowers someone in any way, whether it's revolutionizing the entire thing or just empowering them in some of the things I said earlier about how they can share and how they can, work together more. All of these things lead to a more sovereign type of young musician who feels independent, who feels empowered. They have things like I'm building towards, which just mean that they've managed to just take back some control where it could be taken back in their art and in the way they work and in the way that they trade. Already I think young people are growing up with this, everyone's a trader now. That's not just the left to the rich and all of that. And so I think the quicker we get to musicians who walk into a lawyer's office like with a completely different attitude, that is why should I sign this? What are you doing for that? That's what really changes the music industry. Once there's just a bunch of musicians who are actually looking out for what's good for them and taking that money back, taking that power back, that's how eventually that power gets eaten away, because it's not going to let it happen any other way.
So it's an issue of ownership and distribution that
yeah
solves that. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. I'd love to hear that. I'm always kind of rooting for kind of the underdog, the producers, the makers, the people who actually do the work. And I'm less sympathetic to the suits and the lawyers and the the capitalists who extract value. So I love seeing that, inscriptions are beyond just monkey JPEGs, that it's also empowering of creative people, ownership.
Look, as a musician, you would have to go through your publishers, for example, to get all the information about where and when your music was used. This is just one thing, and it's quite a big thing, but it's one thing that all musicians have just had to deal with, which is like, I have a trusted third party, probably several, if I'm globally putting anything out, who I just have to trust, who tell me when and where my music was used. And half the time, these performing rights societies, they have crazy archaic systems that if there's a space out of place or a misspelled word, then the song doesn't exist. All of that now can be put back into the hand of the musician. So at the very least, you now don't have to call anyone up to say where and when was it used, because now there's a ledger that records this stuff. And so even just that is going to be empowering. The fact that you're not completely reliant on someone else to know what's going on, which is partly where all these middlemen have come from. And now, if anything, they're creating this environment where they're kind of needed. It's almost being more complicated. They go, oh, you still need us because you can't do this. It's all so complicated, and this is all supposed to just break that down. They go, no, have a musician go, no, it's not complicated. I don't need you, mate.
Yeah. And that's the whole idea, at least Bitcoin, the money, right? Peer-to-peer electronic cash. And so this is more peer-to-peer audio and without middlemen. And you use the word ledger, which is obviously very important. There's a ledger of all this. It's a transparent and open ledger that also has metadata, that also has files, that's also money. So I don't know how this goes with lightning payments, or if there's something that you can do programming, Bitcoin payment for something. Have you thought about that? Is there a conceptual framework for that?
When you're talking
actually
about
using
Lightning,
Bitcoin with these?
Yeah, for certainly. This is the whole kind of idea, is that, there is this payment network. This is like an audio layer one with its own network. But yeah, the two can totally work together. That's the idea, is that you end up with a peer-to-peer system where the money goes from the listener to the musician. And then if that listener base is growing, why is it growing? Is it growing because of on-chain stuff? Okay, well, then that's all down to the owners on-chain. If it's growing off chain, then there's going to be some people off chain going, oh, we're marketing this, we're doing that and that. But again, because the money's gone direct to the musician, it's the musician who then decides who to pay, which is beautiful, which is like something that I never thought there was an actual way to. And this is the beginning of that. This is definitely the beginning of that. There's going to be some stuff that comes out of this sequencer that at some point a label is going to want to sign, and they are going to have to be the ones to move, because for a start, there's no recording. If someone eventually makes a hit using this software and insists that no one records it, that it is distributed as an ordinal composition, then that label is going to have to be the ones to tell their lawyers to draw up new rules, because they're not going to really, to begin with, know how to sign it, because there's no recording. So I'm just in. This is all just being part of the evolution of how this thing gets better. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how it gets there, but I do have a very strong feeling that this is a very good move and a very good opening for a new world of kind of production and relationships in the industry.
Yeah, it seems like you're starting to get the word out there. I just kind of follow the Twitter threads and I see people responding to it and reacting to it. And I think by you just putting it out there, you know what you have, and I like the user interface. I like it. It's really interesting. So you're just putting it out there, starting. You built something, people are starting to use it, and then you kind of don't know where it's going to go. I think you probably have a decent idea of where it can go, but this is technology. And Danny Yang said something interesting too. He's like, you're talking about recursion, and he said people are going to use this in ways that we didn't think of, and I think that's really exciting. To have that. Because think how music, it changes. And so the things you're building now, someone's going to use it and you're like, oh, well, that's so obvious now. Why didn't I think of that?
Can't wait for that. I mean, that's what the open source environment is best for. That's kind of why, I'm not a developer. I'm a musician. I built the sequencer because it was going to be, well, again, like I said, it was almost an accident falling into it. But then I started really working on it because I realized how much fun and how well it worked. And so I kept working on it, but all the time thinking at some point, some actual digital synth emulation genius is going to spot this and go, oh my God, I want to do this stuff on Bitcoin. And then hopefully get in time. I mean, I have created a GitHub for the sequencer, like a public GitHub. There's a couple of people, kind of the guy who's already helping sort of do the front end stuff. But I'd love for it just to be a community thing. It's got kind of to the limits of my abilities, but the quicker that I'm trying to already build some stuff into the sequencer that will, have a way, for anyone to build something at any point in the future that will, be able to be loaded into the sequencer, because the idea is, eventually you want to have all these different effects units. You want to have every channel be able to go through any number. And this is the other beauty of, because these things are all in the same domain. I mean, I think that's the thing that surprised me with how well the samples come together, because everything is in the same domain. It just operates very, very smoothly. And so I haven't yet found the limit for doing any number of recursions. I think the more, it's like Danny, Danny put the 3JS library, the 3D library. They inscribed that around 200,000 or something, very early. And I didn't hear about that until, I don't know, a month ago or a little bit before, maybe a week before they actually announced and launched it. I heard about it through someone who was working with them and was kind enough to send me the links. I'd been on a few chats saying I was working on this other project with these 3D models that I was trying to build, and I'd been trying to build my own 3D libraries Inscribing, because 3JS it was out of my budget to do that. It's like 350 kilobytes, but I was taking the bits I needed to build my own libraries, and then I hear, oh, these guys have already inscribed it, and they inscribed it months ago, and it's like, oh my God, how much foresight is that? Someone just contacted me the other day, I think, who has inscribed MIDI.js, and then I just need someone to inscribe tone.js, and then on the music side, we can have, library access to things that will again increase the efficiency, the timing, the stability of the sequencer. So I mean, Danny was amazing.
Yeah, he saw that pretty early. Yeah. I was going to ask you, you brought up ChatGPT. You had this Twitter thread where you asked ChatGPT, like, what are the 20 things I think you can do with this, and also to summarize. So you have used that, I think, to maybe explain things and maybe to even kind of brainstorm a little bit. I'm thinking about, if you have all these files as inscriptions, right? I wonder if AI can pull from all that. So you might say, okay, I want a soundtrack to my movie that sounds like this, that whatever it is, the prompts are you have to do. And they'll pull from these
Yes,
audio files
that's an
and then
awesome
use a
idea.
recursion. Have you,
That's
what
an
do you
awesome
think
idea.
about
I mean,
that?
this again would mean that like the library right now is just so small. Whether AI could eventually be, probably would be powerful enough at some point to just be able to just scour for audio. But obviously having it kind of in the ordinal standard where it's all indexed. Once we have an indexer, that's a really neat idea. Because one of the things I had a conversation with someone quite recently with a gaming company, like, how could this interact with games? I'm like, in such an amazing way, because this is all algorithmic. It doesn't, the songs don't become mixes. They are an algorithm. They are instructions on putting things together. And so your game can algorithmically interact with a song in a way like never before. Like, so when a character gets a level up, rather than going, well, we want to have like 3 different theme tunes for this character, depending on their level, you can now have a theme tune that literally evolves alongside the character. So as the character like finds, picks up some instrument or object or something, that just changes like the effect on this instrument, or it changes the timing of like the hi-hat, or it just changes the from a major to a minor tone, or anything you want to do can be done in really small iterative steps. So it's like you could have like a sort of soundtrack that evolves as much as your character evolves without ever being part of the same, without being written, to work with one another. You can sort of find a way to go, okay, we're going to build songs that have this way of evolving through instructions that come out of our game, saying, okay, such and such has happened. What does that change in the song? And it can be anything it changes in the song. Once we've got a full production environment and an enormous library of songs, that again does depend on that. Because at the moment, the library is probably only around 100 samples or something.
It'll get there though. Definitely.
Yeah, I think so,
It'll be big enough. So then people like that, companies like that don't have to necessarily write the music. It's more so than they need to think about programming the music.
I
Because you were
guess like
talking
they
about,
could work with a musician, they could do it
yeah,
themselves, or they could work with a musician to sort of, it can work in any way they want. All they ultimately want is to have a song that exists in this programmatic, algorithmic state that then their algorithm can go, okay, let's play. When I change this, you do that. When I do that, you do that, and just sort of the sky's the limit. Like you said before, I can't wait to see what people do with this stuff. I've taken it as far as I can as like an individual, and now I'm kind of more playing with it than anything and just trying to figure out some of the sort of more boring parts to getting the standard to work really well for people. But yeah, I just can't wait to see what people do with this. I know it's going to be mind blowing, because even what I think, and I do think about this stuff a lot, I think about what's possible, but there's stuff that's just not possible now because of some of these other little bits of software that don't exist yet. But that's going to never end. I mean, this is just the biggest shared hard drive we've ever known. This is the thing, is it's one hard drive that we all share. That's the real beauty of this. It's like, I don't have to send you anything other than links, but ultimately we share whatever we do in that Bitcoin blockchain data space is shared with everybody. And that's,
yeah.
really
Yeah, it can be
huge.
powerful. And that's why one reason I wanted to have you on the Ordinals podcast is so you can kind of share about this, kind of get the word out, maybe beyond the kind of people that follow you on Twitter, but other people, right, who maybe don't know you on Twitter, but they find this interesting. So hopefully this episode will get out to people, contribute. I think like a lot of things, it just takes a little bit of time. It takes one person to kind of do this one weird thing and people, oh, I get it, in some weird way. And this is why I love this Twitter thread that you use ChatGPT to help you out with all the different ways that they could benefit. And I really hope people will follow this. I'm just going to scroll through these really quick, just so they're on record, and we could just kind of dive in there. We have a few minutes left, but I'll just hit a few. So besides just kind of music files, here's a few I'm going to run through really fast. Historical records, like important speeches, public addresses, language preservation. So you have endangered languages, which would be very interesting. You can combine different words to say different things. Another one is education. So people could access, reliable audio content. Proof of authenticity is another one. So we kind of talked about that one, though, about the source of truth for authentic recordings. Number 6 was auditory health research. So you could have a collection of these health-related audio, like heartbeats, breathing patterns. I think having a standard thing to
That'd be interesting,
measure
actually. Like,
health on would be
when you do an
interesting.
audit, when you do a test on your ears, that'd be interesting to have them on there. Just because, again, it's like any technician in the world could use those, knowing that it is the same sound. It is exactly the same sound that you've been told to use, rather than that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that one until you just said that.
Yeah, the integrity of the sound. So you're not,
Having a standard, and it's like that's the
yeah,
standard. That's the one you use, and that's the standard. Like they have that crazy weight that's like 1 kilogram ball that's like kept in a
yeah.
vacuum somewhere. It's like, okay, now we've got that. Those audio standards can exist here, where you all agree this is the standard for X, Y, and Z sound.
Yeah, I love that. A few more scientific data preservation. So audio data related to like wildlife, space exploration could be be there for future research, public service announcements, emergency warnings. And I like this one, number 10, personal mementos, like voice recordings, wedding vows, children's first words. Like, this is what I think of, Jim. Like, if you were to upload various files from like when you got married and the birth of your child, and then it's their birthday, and then they graduate from high school, and they win this award, and then you could use recursion to kind of put all those things together. Have you thought about like more personal things like that?
I mean, I proposed to my wife on the edges of the CD. I actually was about 6 months later than I meant to propose, and we'd had a few arguments about it. She thought I was never going to ask her. It's like, I'm just waiting for the album to get finished. But once I had it finished, it was written around the edge of the album. So I'm very sentimental like this. And when you were talking about going back 30 years, I'm like, this is probably what I would have done. Would have been, maybe a proposal that I inscribed or something. Like an audio proposal would have been nice. Like a song. And the words or something, but yeah, I'm totally down with all that sort of stuff. And like you said earlier as well, old relatives and stuff, putting these things in, it can be very meaningful, having those sorts of things. And that's not just restricted to audio either. I think that there'll be, my standard, I haven't looked at it with video, but I'm guessing just using the same standard would apply to video as well. So people could take short clips. They want to be short, but again, if the money's there, cut them up into different pieces, but then using the same standard probably to convert it to base 64, your audio and your video, into a single text document, which is then put into the same standard with all the metadata, and then you can again just pull those back together to make and again with AI saying, make me a mix that's all about the times we spent here or there or whatever, a bit like your iPhone does these days.
Yeah, I love that. It's the future mixtape, right? The mixtape comes back, but it's audio, visual, it's sounds, it's voice, it's songs. A lot of exciting stuff here, Jim. I'm really glad you came on the show. I think this is going to hopefully spread awareness of your project, of what's possible. And also it's opened my mind to, well, how it works, first of all, but then also what you can do with it. So I'm really going to be happy to share this. I want to finish on one question that I ask all of our guests. And I think for you, I know you're going to have a good answer. And the question is there one inscription or several inscriptions that you would never sell or transfer? And if so, what are they and why?
I don't have a huge amount. I don't have any massively valuable inscriptions or anything. I've got some early ones, but I think possibly like the first audio one that I made, my first Ordinal, maybe the first sequencer. I did inscribe the first sequencer, but so it's there for anyone to use. No one needs to own it to use it. So I've no reason to give that away. Unless it was worth an absolute fortune, and then I would, because I could always use it every day because it's just there on the blockchain. So I don't know. I don't know how all this stuff. I don't really know where the value proposition is sometimes in these things, other than being early. I get that. And so I think with these things, there is that value to these things that I've made in that they were the first of their kind.
It's also subjective value, right? I asked Charlie Spears, and sometimes that's not, it's this thing that's worth a lot of money now. It's just something really sentimental to him that he would say, it's so sentimental. I would never even transfer it. I can't even think about selling it. It's more, even that. And I think that's going to become more common as more people use it. More like non-commercial inscriptions, I guess I would call them.
Yeah, it's things that are made for yourself,
Yeah. Again, Jim, I want to thank you for coming on the Ordinals podcast. Everyone, please check out what Jim is doing. So Jim, where can people learn about, Audionals and then the other stuff you're doing?
So they can go to audionals.com, which is audionals.com. and then they can play with the sequencer and they can upload inscribe some samples. And if they're really into it, I'd love it if people would donate to help me with my research, because at the moment I don't really have much income from this stuff, if anything. So that would be great as well. And then also check out thisisnumber1.com, which is the original platform that we set up on Stacks, doing all amazing layer 2 NFT things. And you can follow me on Twitter. It's Jim.btc with the dot spelt D-O-T. JIMDOTBTC is my handle on Twitter, and follow at Ordinals as well. And just stay tuned and get in touch. I love hearing from people. I love working with people. So yeah, if you're into this stuff, give me a shout. I'll always answer.
Please do so. I recommend everyone do that. Obviously, Jim's a collaborative guy, creative guy, experience. That's another good thing about Age Right, is Jim's got the experience with music and everything else. So a great resource for everyone. And again, one last time, Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Ragnar. It's been a great chat. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please rate and review our show. Subscribe to the Ordinals Podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or your favorite app, and follow us on Twitter at the OrdPod. Drop us a line at podcasts@ord.media for topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like us to interview. Ordinals 2024 conference is taking place in Nashville. Early bird passes are available now. Visit ord.media and sign up for our newsletter. Thanks for listening to the Ordinals Podcast, produced by Ord Media.